Hello, everybody. It is I, Mr. Aaron, and I am returning once again for some more of Dragonology Chronicles: The Dragon's Eye. So, you may remember when we left off yesterday, they had just completed a game of soccer against Jamal the Wyvern, who decided he was tired of guarding the apple scented ball from going into his cave, and so he just hid the ball up in a tree where they couldn't get to it. And then they discovered somebody had let Jamal out of the compound, and while they were all distracted trying to recapture Jamal, somebody broke into Dr. Drake's house and into his study and stole his dragon diary. And so now they are setting off on a quest to find some of the legendary items because they know it's Ignatius Crook, the dastardly villain that has come after the dragon diary because he left them a note. And so they have arrived at the place they need to go, and they were going to take the SASD's research boat, the Hydra, but it was missing. Dum, dum, dum. So that is where we are picking up today.
Cornwall, is it? So this is what we're reduced to,
said Captain Hezekiah when Dr. Drake explained that he would like to hire the boat for a pleasure trip.
I'm sure you'll not get much pleasure aboard the Sea Snake, said the captain. Why, the quarters have nearly all been converted to take cargo. But as you are in such a hurry, and if you can see your way clear to paying this sum...
Here he showed Dr. Drake a slip of paper, at which Dr. Drake raised his eyebrows, but then shrugged and nodded, saying,
As long as you have at least one cabin fit for a young lady, Captain, then needs must. Mr. Lubber, would you do the honors?
Mr. Lubber went off to fetch some money and to get a man to bring up our luggage. Dr. Drake turned to us.
Now, I would much rather have had you aboard the Hydra, but since the trip will only take a couple of days, I think we will manage. But you must take care, of course, not to talk to the crew at all about our trip, and you must not mind anything that you see on the voyage.
And with that, he stepped aboard. It did not take long for us to install ourselves on the Sea Snake. Captain Hezekiah rather reluctantly gave up his cabin for Beatrice, while Dr. Drake and I made do with 2 hammocks out by the galley. But for some reason the weather or tides were all wrong, and we could not leave until the following morning. By then, even though we had not actually been to sea, Beatrice was looking pretty green. When we sailed out of the Portsmouth harbor, she soon took to her cabin, where she stayed for most of the voyage. I was very excited to be on a ship, however dirty and untidy, and I managed to ignore the crew, who mostly seemed to spend their time lazing about or checking to see whether the sun had gone down over the yardarm. Meanwhile, Dr. Drake spent a good deal of time with me, explaining the names of all the different sea birds that flew above us, pointing out a school of dolphins, and teaching me the names of all the promontories and lighthouses that we could see along the coast. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just as we were about to come in sight of Portland, a storm began to blow up, and we had to head further out to sea. But the storm did not last long, and as the light faded, I was just beginning to think about taking to my hammock for a second night when Dr. Drake drew me to one side.
Daniel, there is something I want to show you, he said. It is the reason that I have come to Cornwall by sea. I would have shown it to Beatrice as well, but she's still sleeping off her seasickness.
Does it have something to do with dragon dust? I asked.
Indeed, said Dr. Drake, but we must be very careful not to let the sailors see what we are up to, or things could turn out badly. Meet me by the starboard bow at midnight.
All right, I said. But isn't there a chance Ignatius may have found the dragon dust first?
There's a chance, said Dr. Drake. But fortunately my diary gives only very general clues as to its location. With any luck, it will take Ignatius quite some time to find the right spot.
At 10 minutes before midnight, as I waited for Dr. Drake, I looked toward the distant shore. Since it was a clear night, I could see enough to make out that it was mainly made up of rocky cliffs dotted with small sandy bays. There was the occasional light from a house at the top, a distant lighthouse away to the left, and another light that seemed to be moving slowly between the Sea Snake and the cliffs. It was not very bright, and I wondered if it was the light from another boat.
"I don't think the sailors can see us from here," whispered Dr. Drake when he arrived, looking around him to see if we were being spied on. "We have passed Plymouth and are quite near a town called St. Austell. Very few people know this, but it was not just Sir Francis Drake's fireships and terrible weather that helped defeat the Spanish Armada when they tried to invade England, you know. Watch." And before my wondering eyes he took out a small packet of powder. "This," he said, "is serpent bait. Ignatius didn't have time to find it at my house. It is very rare, but it is not magical. It merely consists of the powdered horn of a narwhal, mixed with the powdered bone from a whale and a leopard seal, and the dried tentacle of a giant squid. These creatures are the chief prey of the beast I am about to attract, which has a very good sense of smell." At that he leaned over the rail and sprinkled the powder onto the surface of the sea, whispering, "Serpent of the briny deep, if thou wake or if thou sleep, stir thyself and come to me, serpent, serpent of the sea." For a while nothing happened, but then, as I looked far out, I saw a movement on the surface of the sea. At first it just seemed to be eddies on the water, reflected under the bright light of the moon. But soon the eddies grew bigger and bigger, as though they were being made by some huge beast. Indeed, within moments a monstrous gray snake-like head, with huge spines on the top, reared out of the water. It looked directly at Dr. Drake, who signaled to it by covering his face with his hands, then bunching them into fists, with the index fingers pointing up. "This is the serpent sign," he said. Finally he leaned over the rail and whispered something to the serpent in a language I could not understand. What happened next was quite amazing. The serpent disappeared beneath the waves, and, after a short time, returned with a small box in its mouth, holding it as gently as a mother dragon holds a chick. Then it reached the box up to Dr. Drake, who spoke to it again. "This," said Dr. Drake, showing me the box, "is the box of dragon dust. I have been friendly with that serpent for a good many years, and I was with Ebenezer when he consigned his last quantity of dragon dust to its care." "Can it speak English?" I said. "Not exactly," said Dr. Drake, "but it can understand some Dragonish. If you like, it will tell you its name. Lean over the rail and say, 'Ivuwan Tuomone Milsayit.'" I leaned over the rail and said the words. "Quietly, Daniel," whispered Dr. Drake. "And don't forget to write this down in your record book when you get home. Now, can you see what the serpent is trying to tell us?" And as I looked, I could see what the swirls seemed to be forming into letters. "First there's an L," said Dr. Drake. "Yes, and is that an E?" I asked. "It is, and then a V." "And then another L," I cried. "No, wait, it's not an L, but an I," said Dr. Drake. "Yes," I said, "and the next letter seems to be an A." But we could look no longer, for suddenly a lantern shone behind us, and a voice cried, "Captain Hezekiah! They're summoning the sea worm! They're witches! They've called the Leviathan!" We turned and found that most of the crew had sneaked up on us, brandishing all sorts of knives and pistols. "I am sorry, Daniel," said Dr. Drake. "I rather fear that the crew is unhappy with us." "Indeed," said Captain Hezekiah, arriving with Beatrice, whom he had pulled from her cabin, and who had turned from looking sleepy, angry, and indignant to looking terrified in an instant. "Foolish men," said Hezekiah. "Raising monsters! That's bad luck in any sailor's book." He turned to the rest of the crew. "We were right to be suspicious, but now we see that it was for the wrong reasons. We thought this man had come aboard to investigate those cargoes we bring ashore free of taxes. Smuggling, they call it, bah! But this is much worse. He's a sorcerer!" Then, shoving Beatrice towards us, where she clung to Dr. Drake, he cried, "Come on, lads! If they can raise a worm, it's time we raised an old custom. Make 'em walk the plank, and it'll be grog all around. But first I shall take that box. Who knows what sum it will bring, or what's inside?"
and he grabbed Ebenezer's box from Dr. Drake and took it inside. A plank was swiftly lashed to the foredeck under the rails, and we were made to walk out onto it. When I reached the end, I looked down at the ocean beneath me. Then I looked back at the smugglers with their sharp knives. I heard a splash. Dr. Drake had jumped in. Beatrice and I followed him, hitting the water together. As I reached the surface, I saw that Captain Hezekiah had returned. He didn't look very happy.
"Fools!" he cried. "Idiots! You should have tied their arms! They'll swim away! I'll fetch the harpoons!"
Chapter 18. The Buka Hole. Even though our situation was pretty desperate, to see poor Dr. Drake floundering and flailing about with his arms as he tried to swim lightened the gravity of the whole scene somewhat, and probably saved his life. For between laughing and being unable to aim accurately at Dr. Drake as he zigged and zagged away from the boat in the darkness, Hezekiah and his crew of would-be pirates missed shot after shot. Between each shot, they needed to haul the ramshackle harpoon they had erected back onto its line. Meanwhile, Beatrice and I, who could both swim very well, had found a piece of driftwood and were kicking gamely towards the shore. Still, the crew of the Sea Snake kept firing and turned the boat back towards us again and again. No doubt they would have scored an ace eventually had we not had another stroke of luck. For at that moment the Sea Serpent rose in front of the ship, taking a harpoon shot that was headed straight for Dr. Drake. The Sea Serpent shook with rage. Captain Hezekiah grabbed the rope, pulled the harpoon back in on its line, and took careful aim. This time he was aiming directly at me.
"Good riddance!"
he shouted. But before Captain Hezekiah could release the harpoon, I felt something wet and rubbery around my waist. It was the tip of the sea serpent's tail. It lifted me high out of the water in a huge arc and deposited me on the beach. Then Beatrice was lifted up and set down next to me. Finally the sea serpent turned to where Dr. Drake had been trying to swim, but he was nowhere to be seen. The serpent's tail disappeared under the water for a moment, then reappeared, gripping Dr. Drake tightly around the waist, and deposited him, spluttering and choking, on the shore. Now the serpent turned its full attention to the ship. The crew stopped firing as Captain Hezekiah ordered them to pile on all the sail they could, but they didn't stand a hope of outrunning the monster. My last view of the sea snake was of the serpent looping its namesake with several gigantic coils. It seemed that Captain Hezekiah was to go down like Ahab in Moby Dick. And good riddance, I thought.
"Well, this is a run situation, and make no mistake,"
said Dr. Drake as we stood dripping on the shore underneath the cliffs.
"At least we are alive," said Beatrice. "Is this Cornwall?"
"Yes," said Dr. Drake. "We must make our way up to the top of these cliffs at once. St. Austell isn't far. We can find an inn there where we can dry out. I shall send a telegraph to Emery so that he can send us some money, since we have lost all of our things. I am devastated that we lost the dragon dust." But at that moment the serpent's tail swung back over the beach, holding the box of dragon dust, which it placed neatly on a rock. Then it disappeared again. Dr. Drake grinned broadly and picked it up.
"Well, at least some things are going our way," he said.
We started up a winding path that led up from the beach to the top of the cliff. I noticed that the dawn could not be far off. At least climbing warmed me up a little.
"Did Captain Hezekiah know about us?" I asked.
"I don't think he did," said Dr. Drake. "What worries me more is the whereabouts of Ignatius Crook. I would guess that he is still trying to find the right location to call the sea serpent. But if he is anywhere close, he may well have seen the commotion back there."
"Do you think we're safe for now?" asked Beatrice.
Just then I could have sworn I saw what seemed to be a very small blue dragon fly out from behind a rock above us and then fly back again. It had beady little eyes and looked at us meanly.
"I'm afraid not," said a loud, harsh voice. A large, roughly dressed man carrying a nasty-looking cudgel suddenly stepped out from behind a rock, barring our way. As he did so, he flipped open his coat for a moment so that we could clearly see he was carrying a pistol. Another man, who was also carrying a stout cudgel, stepped out behind us.
After looking around to make sure we were really alone, the first man calmly took out his pistol and pointed it at Dr. Drake. At that, the man we had seen in the pub doorway opposite Dr. Drake's shop calmly stepped from his hiding place and smiled at us. The small, wicked-looking dragon was sitting on his shoulder like a parrot, baring its teeth. "My dear Dr. Drake," he said, "this is a nice surprise."
"What do you want, Ignatius?" said Dr. Drake.
"You know what I want," said Ignatius Crook. "Just don't do anything ill-advised. I think I'll take that." And he reached out and took the box of dragon dust from Dr. Drake. "You're a beast!" said Beatrice, glaring at him. At that, Ignatius reached up and prodded his pet dragon, which leapt from his shoulder and made a beeline for Beatrice and gave her a nasty nip on the arm. "Hey!" she called. "Perhaps that will teach you that children should be seen and not heard," said Ignatius. "See if he's got anything else useful, would you?" One of the men grinned and began searching Dr. Drake's dripping pockets. But all they contained were a watch, which did not seem to be working, a pencil, a compass, some loose coins, and a small whistle in the shape of a dragon's head. "Give that to me," said Ignatius.
"Why?" said the man. "I found it." "I wouldn't blow on it if I were you," said Dr. Drake as the man held it aloft. Then he put it to his lips and blew out a shrill note that reminded me of the sound Scorcher made after Dr. Drake had fed him. It was obviously a dragon whistle. "I said give it to me, you fool!" said Ignatius. He glanced up at the sky, took the whistle, and put it in his own pocket. "Tie them up," he said. After the men tied us up, Ignatius led us up the cliff path. We soon found ourselves among the ruins of some old towers and open pits. I had read about Cornwall in my encyclopedia, and guessed this must be the site of a tin mine. Above one of the pits was a mining crane with a rope attached to a winch. "Are you sure this is going to work?"
asked the man with the pistol. He was still pointing it at Dr. Drake.
"I'd rather bump them all on the head and push them into the pit."
"I'm not paying you to ask questions," said Ignatius. "I'm paying you to do what I say and keep quiet. That pit is a buka hole. I even found a rhyme about it in your diary, Doctor. It goes, 'Drop them in one by one, and one by one they'll go. A good feed's what the buka needs, and they will do just so.'"
As Ignatius sang the rhyme, a savage gleam lit up in his eye. When he had finished, the man said,
"Well, I don't like it, but you're the boss. You quite sure there's something down there? I wouldn't want 'em to be able to identify us."
"Oh, yes," said Ignatius. "Listen." And he picked up a pebble and tossed it into the hole.
After a moment, a series of loud, angry noises, like a cross between the grunt of a dragon and the thudding of a huge hammer, came out of the hole. They were going to throw us in there? Now I was shivering with fear. "Can't you hear the buka knocking?" said Ignatius.
"What's a buka?" asked Beatrice.
"Oh, it is a type of dragon, my dear," said Ignatius, "and not a very nice type. Not like Flitz here." He paused and stroked his pet, which grunted contentedly. "Dr. Drake has told you all about dragons, hasn't he? Big wings, huge claws, sharp teeth, terrible flames. These ones live in tin mines, but I won't say too much about them. That would spoil the surprise. You are going to meet one very soon indeed." "But we haven't done anything to hurt you," I said. "Oh, that's very nice of you," said Ignatius. "Throw them in." The men attached the ropes binding our hands to another rope which they fastened onto the crane. Then, using the winch, they pulled us up. "Ow!" said Beatrice. "Help!" I shouted, but there was no one else about. "Surely you will listen to reason," said Dr. Drake as we swung perilously above the gaping pit. Ignatius smiled. He swept at the rope with a knife. It cut through, and we fell headlong into the buka hole. We landed in a heap at the bottom. I was on top of Dr. Drake, and Beatrice was on top of me. It was so dark I couldn't see much, but I was sure that I heard something large hastening away into the darkness. "Is everyone all right?" said Beatrice after a while.
"Well, I think I'm all right," whispered Dr. Drake. He was out of breath. He had landed rather heavily to break our fall.
"Where is the buka?" I asked.
I had expected to see a lot of skulls and bones from the previous victims, but in the dark all I could see was a vague sheen of ore running along the stone walls, and a few fish bones. Dr. Drake managed to cut through the rope by rubbing it on a sharp piece of stone he had landed on, and we slowly began to disentangle ourselves and get up.
"Shh," said Dr. Drake. "Not quite so loud. We don't want Ignatius to hear us. I'm afraid it seems he doesn't know very much about bukas."
"How is that?" asked Beatrice. "Well, it's quite typical of him, really. I expect that all he's done is found out that there is a legend about a terrible man-eating buka in this hole, and decided that it's all true. He never did manage to separate dragon legend from dragon science, and he obviously hasn't bothered to find out the full facts in my diary."
"So there is no buka, then?" I asked.
"Oh, yes, there certainly is a buka," said Dr. Drake. "It's just not dangerous, that's all. In fact, bukas are extremely timid. A buka makes that knocking sound when it's trying to escape. But Ignatius is right about one thing. The buka is a type of dragon. Most legends cast them in the role of some kind of goblin or fairy."
"So how do we get out?" asked Beatrice.
"Well," said Dr. Drake, "first we have to convince Ignatius and his hired ruffians that we're not coming out. So I want you to scream and shout as though you're being attacked by a buka, and then go absolutely quiet." Even though we were in a pretty grim situation, both Beatrice and I had to do our utmost to stop ourselves from laughing out loud as we howled and screamed and generally tried to sound as though we were being eaten alive by a buka. Dr. Drake joined in, and so did the poor frightened buka itself, which set up a terrible roaring and knocking. After a while we stopped, but the knocking from the frightened buka continued.
"Now," whispered Dr. Drake, "I hope that sounded convincing enough. You both died beautifully, but we must find our way out."
"How do we do that?"
I asked.
"Didn't I teach you anything at all at Castle Drake?" he said. "I might not always be around when there are dragons about."
I looked round the hole. Now that my eyes had adjusted to the dim light, I could see that the floor was covered in fish bones. There were also some very clear tracks that seemed as though they disappeared straight into a wall.
"There!"
said Beatrice, pointing at them.
"Good," said Dr. Drake. "Now follow them."
"But—" I began.
"Just follow them," he said.
Beatrice and I followed the tracks up to the wall. Beatrice touched it, and it crumbled away at once, revealing a passage that must have once been one of the old mine workings. The knocking sound grew louder.
"It's an old buka trick," said Dr. Drake. "They try to hide by covering up the entrance to their hole, but they're too stupid to wipe away their tracks."
We squeezed into the low passageway and crawled along it until we came to a fork. I began heading down the left-hand passage away from the knocking sound, but Dr. Drake pulled me back.
"Let's follow the buka," he said.
And so we crawled up the other passageway, which soon opened up enough so that we could stand up. There was a shaft above our heads that was too high to reach, but it let in some light. We followed the passage as it gradually rose up and up. The knocking sound grew louder and louder, until suddenly we came upon the buka itself. It took one look at us with a pair of enormous eyes and turned in panic to the sheer wall at the end of the passage. In some ways, the buka did not seem very different from Weasel, except that it was of a sandy color and a shorter tail, and had a large bony projection on the top of its head, which it was using to dig into the wall. That was where the knocking sound had been coming from. Suddenly it broke through the wall at the end of the tunnel and disappeared in a shower of sand and dirt. As it did so, light flooded in.
"Well,"
said Dr. Drake. "This may not be the time to say it, but you are extremely privileged. I do not know of anyone else alive who has ever gotten that close to a Buka before. When we get back, I shall expect a full report. But now we must leave this place by the door the Buka has made. Keep quiet until I can be sure the coast is clear." So, after a short sandy crawl, we found ourselves back near the ruins of the tin mine. Dr. Drake went ahead of us. Then he came back to report that there was now no sign of Ignatius or the other ruffians. "There is only one thing that puzzles me," said Dr. Drake, gazing up at the sky. "What is that?" I asked. "My dragon whistle did not seem to work," he said. "Are we sure?" asked Beatrice, pointing to some large tracks right next to the hole that Ignatius had thrown us into. It was only a few miles into the town of St. Austell. Dr. Drake immediately checked us into some rooms in a hotel and set off a telegram to Emery. He came back with a fresh change of clothes for each of us. "We must get to Bodmin as soon as possible," he said. "We shall stay here tonight, but for you two need to eat, rest, and get thoroughly dried out, so I have arranged for a coach to take us there first thing in the morning." Chapter 19. Bodmin. The town of Bodmin is said to have been founded a great many years ago by a Cornish saint named Petroc. According to Dr. Drake, St. Petroc, who was also the founder of Padstow, or Petroc's Stow as it was originally known, was one of the earliest dragonologists to live in this country. One legend tells of him banishing a fearsome dragon named Tregeagle, and another tells of his great kindness to a dragon with a splinter in its eye. Until recent times, water from a well in the grounds of St. Patrick's Church was said to have the power of curing all sorts of eye complaints, and, of course, St. Petroc's healing chalice was listed among the 12 treasures of the secret and ancient society. As we set off through the town, Dr. Drake said, "I'm sure I don't need to mention that we need to be very careful here not to run into Ignatius or Alexandra, or indeed both of them." "But why would Ignatius come here?" I asked. "There is every reason to suppose that Ignatius has found the clue about Ebenezer's grave in my diary. Although I failed to understand the clue, I'm guessing that he and Alexandra will at least come here to check it out." "Where is the grave?" I asked. "It is in St. Petroc's churchyard," said Dr. Drake. "We're going there now." When we arrived, the churchyard was empty, except for a gardener who was working in the far corner. We went in and began to search around for a gravestone bearing the name of Ebenezer Crook. Although we must have looked over every gravestone at least twice, there did not seem to be any sign of his at all. "I am quite sure that he was buried in this churchyard," said Dr. Drake. Beatrice and I went to ask the gardener if he knew where Ebenezer Crook was buried. He was tending a grave that did not yet seem to have a stone. "Are you relatives?" he asked. "For if not, I must ask why you are interested in Mr. Crook, and if you are, then I must ask you to prepare yourselves for a shock." "We are the children of two of his friends from London," Beatrice explained, waving Dr. Drake over. And that is where we're going to leave off for today, guys. So thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to tune in for our other live programs, Toddler Time with Miss Becky, Stories with Sunny, and Creating with Constance. Don't forget to come in by the end of the week for your brand new grab-and-go craft bags that we change out at each of the buildings every week. Of course, the libraries are open, but you can still get curbside service if you prefer, and you still have access to digital content through sweetwaterlibraries.com. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody, and we will see you not tomorrow, but on Monday. It is Thursday, so we will pick up the story again on Monday the 3rd at 2 p.m. Have a lovely weekend, everybody, and thank you so much.